Why we love self-deception. Freud's harsh reality. There's a terrifying truth. We rarely talk about one that creeps beneath the surface of our decisions, our relationships, our identity. It's this: we lie to ourselves more than anyone else ever could. Not because we're weak, not because we're evil, and not even because we're lazy. We do it because it's necessary, because it protects us, because it helps us survive in a world that's too overwhelming, too painful, too contradictory to face head-on. Freud didn't just casually observe this tendency, he built an entire psychological model around it. He saw humans not as seekers of truth, but as masters of illusion. And the most haunting part of his insight: we love this illusion. We cling to it. We protect it. We build our lives around it. Because the alternative, radical honesty with ourselves, is a kind of psychological death. But let's be clear, Freud shattered our self-image. Before him, we liked to think of ourselves as rational beings, conscious of our actions, in control of our choices. But Freud said, no, you are not the master of your mind. In fact, most of what drives you is buried deep in the unconscious. Your desires, your fears, your guilt, your shame, they all swirl beneath the surface, shaping your behavior without your permission. And because the truth of who we are is often unbearable, we develop what Freud called defense mechanisms: subtle, brilliant, and often invisible ways we shield ourselves from psychological pain. We repress, we project, we rationalize. We turn away from truth, not because we hate it, but because it threatens the fragile structure we've built to function.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
And yet, here's the twist. Even though these self-deceptions protect us, they also imprison us. They become the walls of our psychological cage. When we deny our own flaws, we can't grow. When we project our darkness onto others, we stay blind to our own potential for harm. When we lie to ourselves about our motivations, we can't make sense of our own lives. We become strangers to ourselves. And this is the brutal irony, we prefer that. We would rather be lost and comfortable than found and shattered. Because the truth doesn't just hurt. It destabilizes. It rearranges your inner world. And that's terrifying. So let me ask you something. What if your most cherished belief about yourself is a lie? What if the story you tell yourself that you're a good person, that you're a victim, that you're in control isn't true, but necessary to keep you sane? How deep are you willing to go to find out? This is where Freud's worldview becomes both unbearable and liberating. He believed that the human mind is at war with itself. The ID wants pleasure, the superego demands morality, and the ego is caught in the middle, juggling chaos. We are not unified beings, we are battlegrounds. And to manage the conflict, we construct narratives. We tell ourselves we're fine. We tell ourselves they're the problem. We tell ourselves the pain is coming from outside, not inside. And in doing so, we build lives that are functional but false. Think about how this plays out in everyday life. You stay in a toxic relationship, telling yourself they'll change, because admitting the truth that you're afraid to be alone hurts too much. You obsess over work, telling yourself I'm just ambitious, because facing the emptiness behind the success would be unbearable. You demonize others who disagree with you, not because they're truly evil, but because it's easier than confronting your own uncertainty. These aren't just bad habits, they're strategic lies. lies designed to keep the fragile ego from collapsing under the weight of reality. But here's the deeper question: what kind of life is built on self-deception? Is it truly your life? Or is it a performance, a mask you wear so convincingly that even you forget it's not your face? And if that's true, who are you underneath the mask? Freud's harsh reality is that most people will never find out. Not because they can't, but because they don't want to. The unconscious wants to stay unconscious. That's its nature. And society doesn't help. In fact, it rewards self-deception. It tells you to be positive, stay strong, focus on the bright side, all of which are just elegant ways of saying, don't look too closely, because if you do, you might unravel everything. Yet, there's a strange power in facing the truth, a kind of inner awakening. When you start to confront your own self-deception, you begin to reclaim your freedom. You stop reacting blindly. You start making choices with awareness. You see your darkness not to indulge it, but to integrate it. And in that painful, ongoing process, you become something rare, a person who knows themselves. That's the paradox Freud leaves us with. Self-deception is both a shield and a prison. It keeps us safe, but it also keeps us small. The question isn't whether you deceive yourself, we all do. The question is, will you have the courage to notice it? The ego's armor, how our mind builds illusions to protect us from ourselves. We spend most of our lives wearing armor we never consciously chose. It's not made of steel or leather, but of ideas so deeply embedded in our minds that we forget they were ever constructed. This armor is the ego's masterpiece. Freud saw the ego not as a villain, but as a necessary gatekeeper, a mediator between our raw, chaotic impulses and the moral demands of the world around us. But here's what makes the ego both fascinating and tragic. It doesn't just protect us from the world. It protects us from ourselves, and in doing so, it often hides the very truths we need to live fully. The ego's job is to keep you functional. It filters your thoughts, manages your anxieties, and helps you survive in a society that constantly demands performance. That sounds helpful, right? And to a degree it is. But the ego's deeper function, the one we rarely notice, is to maintain a consistent self-image. It's terrified of contradiction. It's terrified of chaos. So when reality threatens to break the story you tell about who you are, the ego steps in and rewrites the narrative. Not because it's evil, but because it wants to keep you psychologically intact. And the easiest way to do that is through illusion. Think about how this plays out in your own life. Let's say you see yourself as a kind person. You pride yourself on your empathy. But then one day you're cruel to someone, maybe in a moment of stress, maybe without even realizing it. What happens next? If your ego is strong, you won't revise your self-image. You'll revise the event. You'll tell yourself they deserved it, that it wasn't really cruelty, that you were just being honest. The ego reinterprets the event not to understand it, but to protect your identity as a kind person. And just like that, the truth is buried softly, quietly, beautifully. Freud called this rationalization, and it's one of dozens of defense mechanisms we use without even knowing it. We repress painful memories. We displace anger onto safer targets. We deny uncomfortable realities. We project our flaws onto others. We even turn our own suffering into moral superiority. All of this is done in the name of stability. But too much stability too many illusions, and we become trapped in a false self and ego so insulated from truth that it can no longer grow. What's frightening is how elegant these defenses are. They don't feel like lies. They feel like sanity. They feel like clarity. That's why they're so hard to detect. The ego doesn't scream, it whispers. It doesn't say you're lying to yourself. It says, this is just who you are. And over time, the armor becomes so natural, so familiar, that we forget we're wearing it. We start to believe the story we invented. We start to confuse survival with truth. But here's the cost. The more we protect ourselves from pain, the more we protect ourselves from transformation. Because real growth, real psychological and spiritual evolution requires us to confront what the ego wants to avoid. It requires us to admit that we are not always who we think we are, that we are capable of violence, of selfishness, of envy, of fear, and that, until we face those parts of ourselves, we are not free. We are just performing a version of ourselves that the ego can comfortably manage. So let me ask you something that may sting a little. Who would you be without the story you tell yourself about who you are? If you stripped away the roles, the labels, the justifications, what would remain? Would you recognize yourself? Would you even want to? This is where Freud becomes not just a psychologist, but a philosopher of the deepest kind. He forces us to look inward, not to find peace, but to find reality. And reality, for Freud, is not clean or simple. It's a battlefield between desire and restraint, between the unconscious and the conscious, between the truth and the stories we invent to avoid it. And the ego is the general in that war. It's trying to win a battle that can never be won because the enemy is inside the gates. But that doesn't mean we're doomed. In fact, Freud's message, though often bleak, contains a hidden hope. If we know that the ego is constructing illusions, we can begin to see through them. If we recognize our defense mechanisms, we can start to loosen their grip. If we observe our narratives without immediately believing them, we create space for something rare, inner honesty. And that honesty, it's brutal, but it's also sacred. Because it's the only path to becoming real. Not perfect, not enlightened, just real. So here's the challenge. What illusions are you still clinging to? What parts of yourself have you exiled in order to feel safe, loved, or in control? And what might happen if you invited them back in not to destroy you, but to complete you? The pleasure of the lie, why we choose the comfortable illusion over the unbearable truth. There's a reason why we don't rip off the mask. There's a reason why, even when we know we're lying to ourselves, we choose to keep going. It's not just fear, it's pleasure. It feels good to believe the lie. It feels good to live in a story that makes us the hero, that justifies our pain, that protects us from the sting of reality. Freud understood something most people never want to admit. Self-deception isn't a glitch in our psychology, it's a feature. It's not just something we fall into unwillingly, but it's something we crave, because the truth, when fully faced, is often unbearable. Let's be honest. The truth about ourselves isn't always noble. Sometimes it's petty, jealous, insecure, ashamed, or broken. The truth about the world, it's chaotic, uncertain, and indifferent to our desires. And the truth about other people, they are just as lost, just as flawed, just as scared as we are. So when given the choice between truth and a lie that makes sense, between uncertainty and a story that flatters us, we often choose the lie, not out of weakness, but out of a deep psychological need to feel okay. And that need can be stronger than our need to be right. This is where things get dangerous. Because the more we enjoy the illusion, the more we start to depend on it. We build identities around it. We make decisions based on it. We surround ourselves with people who reinforce it. And suddenly, the lie isn't just a narrative, it's a lifestyle. And anyone who threatens it becomes the enemy. The truth becomes offensive. Honesty becomes an attack. And we defend the illusion not like a story, but like a fortress. Think about the person who refuses to accept that their relationship is over because the illusion of love feels better than the reality of loneliness. Or the person who clings to a belief system that no longer makes sense because it gives them meaning, purpose, community. Or the person who tells themselves they're fine, even as their life quietly crumbles, because admitting the truth would mean confronting years of choices they can't undo. These aren't just lies, they're coping mechanisms, and they work until they don't. And here's the paradox: the more we lie to ourselves, the more we suffer. Because even if the illusion feels good on the surface, something inside us knows. We feel the dissonance. We feel the cracks forming. We feel the weight of the truth pressing against the walls we've built. And that tension, it leaks out in anxiety, in depression, in addiction, in burnout, or in self-sabotage. These symptoms aren't random. They're signals. They're the unconscious screaming, "This isn't real. You're not okay. Something needs to change." But change doesn't come easy, because to give up the lie is to grieve, and to let go of the illusion is to face the very pain we've spent our whole lives avoiding. It's to admit that we were wrong, that we've wasted time, that we've been afraid, that we're not who we thought we were. And that kind of reckoning, it takes courage, it takes strength, it takes a radical commitment to something most people run from: truth at any cost. So let me ask you a brutal question. What lie are you still enjoying too much to let go of? What story have you told for so long that you've forgotten it was ever a story at all? And what might your life look like if you told yourself the truth, not the sugar-coated version, not the half-truth, but the raw, uncomfortable, unfiltered truth? That's not just a personal question. It's a human one. Because what Freud revealed, and what we're still struggling to accept, is that self-deception isn't rare. It's universal. It's part of the human condition. But so is the capacity to wake up. So is the ability to choose something better. Not easier, better. And maybe that's the real divide in life, not between good and bad people, or smart and foolish ones, but between those who are willing to face themselves and those who aren't. Freedom through fire. Why self-honesty hurts, but sets you free. There's a simple truth at the heart of every transformation worth having. It begins with pain. Not the kind that comes from others, but the kind that comes from yourself, the pain of finally seeing what you've spent years avoiding. The pain of admitting you've lied to yourself. The pain of facing the parts of you that are selfish, manipulative, insecure, or afraid. Freud didn't promise that this process would be pleasant. In fact, he warned us, self-awareness is like fire. It burns through illusions, and it will not spare your favorite ones. But if you're willing to walk through that fire, you'll find something on the other side that few people ever touch: freedom. Self-honesty is not a buzzword. It's not a self-help slogan. It's a brutal, continuous practice of exposing your own hypocrisy, your own delusion, your own contradiction. And it doesn't feel good. At first, it feels like losing everything. Because in a way you are. You're losing the version of yourself that was built on comfort, on denial, on stories that made life easier but smaller. And when those stories go up in flames, what's left is terrifying because it's real. It's not curated. It's not polished. It's not made for social media. It's raw, uncertain, and deeply human. But here's the miracle. When you stop lying to yourself, you stop being a prisoner. You stop being at war with your own mind. You stop needing constant validation. You stop fearing the truth. And in that space, something incredible happens. You begin to see. You see your patterns. You see your triggers. You see where your pain really comes from. And for the first time, you're not guessing. You're not reaching for external solutions to internal problems. You're not blaming the world for wounds you've never tried to heal. You're standing in the truth, and even though it hurts, it feels solid. It feels real. That's the irony of self-honesty. It feels like destruction, but it's actually rebirth. Every time you admit something difficult: I was wrong, I'm scared, I don't know who I am, a layer of illusion falls away. And beneath each layer, you find something deeper, something truer. You find the part of you that's been waiting to be seen. Not the actor, not the mask, not the ego, but the observer, the witness. The one who doesn't need to perform because they're not pretending anymore. And yes, that process is lonely, because most people won't go there. Most people will keep choosing comfort. They'll keep curating their image, defending their lies, avoiding their shadow. They'll tell themselves it's strength when it's really fear. And when you start telling the truth to yourself, to others, they may not know how to handle it. They may resist. They may leave. Because your honesty becomes a mirror, and not everyone's ready to look. But the ones who stay, the ones who are also walking through their own fire, those are the people you build a real life with. Not a performance, not an echo chamber. A life grounded in truth, in growth, in mutual awakening. And that life, it may not look perfect, but it feels alive. It feels earned. So here's the final question I'll leave you with. What would your life look like if you stopped lying to yourself completely? What relationships would end? What new ones would begin? What habits would fall away? What purpose would finally emerge from the fog? You already know the answers. They're buried under the stories you've told and retold. But they're there, and they're waiting for you to be brave enough to look, because the truth will not force itself on you. But if you choose it, if you choose the fire, you will burn away everything false. And what's left will be free.